There are moments during a traffic stop where everything looks normal on the outside. But inside the officer's mind, the situation has already shifted into something completely different. Most drivers don't realize this. They think a stop is just a stop, a ticket, maybe a warning, and then they move on with their day. But in reality, trained officers are not just looking at what you did on the road. They're reading behavior, timing, reactions, micro movements that most people don't even know they're giving away. And sometimes, within seconds, a routine stop turns into something far more serious. Let me ask you something before we go deeper. If you were pulled over in Florida right now and the officer suddenly changed their tone, stepped back from your window and started speaking into their radio more than speaking to you, would you know what that means? Or would you just assume it's still a normal traffic stop? I want you to answer that in the comments because this is where most people miss the warning signs entirely. Now stay with me because what I'm about to explain is not just a story. This is how real traffic stops escalate when officers suspect something far beyond a simple violation, and how attempted escape situations are stopped almost instantly before they even fully begin. And yes, in states like Florida, where drug trafficking routes are heavily monitored, officers are trained for exactly these scenarios. Let's break it down. It starts like any other stop. A vehicle traveling slightly above the speed limit on a Florida highway. Nothing extreme. Nothing that would normally raise alarm on its own. The driver signals, pulls over, and stops. At first glance, everything seems routine. But from the moment the officer steps out of the patrol car, the assessment begins. Not the questioning. The assessment. The first thing trained officers notice is reaction time. How quickly did the driver pull over? Was there hesitation? Did the vehicle slow down smoothly? Or did it brake suddenly and unpredictably? These details matter more than people think, because experienced officers know something simple but important. People who are nervous about being stopped react differently than people who are simply surprised, and people carrying something illegal often react differently than both. The officer approaches the vehicle. Everything appears calm, but inside the vehicle, tension may already be building. The officer notices subtle things immediately. Heavy air fresheners, slight shaking in the hands, inconsistent eye contact, overly rehearsed answers, or sometimes the opposite. Complete silence and avoidance. None of these things prove anything on their own, but they create context, and context is everything in law enforcement. The officer asks the standard question, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Most people respond instinctively. But in high-risk stops, trained drivers sometimes hesitate. They overthink. They try to sound perfect. And that's where the officer starts paying closer attention. Because now the interaction is no longer routine. It's analytical. Now let's add another layer. In Florida, especially on major interstate routes, officers are trained to recognize trafficking patterns, not based on appearance alone, but based on behavior clusters. For example, a driver who is overly polite but visibly nervous, a vehicle traveling from known entry corridors to distribution zones, short travel duration with unclear purpose, conflicting answers between driver and passenger. None of this is proof, but it builds reasonable suspicion when combined. And once that threshold starts forming, everything changes. Backup may be quietly requested. A second unit may begin positioning nearby. The tone of the stop becomes more controlled, less conversational, more procedural. Now here's where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think nothing has changed because no one has told them anything. But in reality, the situation has already escalated internally. Now let's talk about the critical moment. The officer returns to the patrol car, runs information, checks records, communicates with dispatch, and in some cases, receives additional intelligence. Maybe the vehicle matches a pattern, maybe there's a flag, maybe nothing is confirmed, but enough concern exists to continue investigation. When the officer returns, the tone is different. Shorter sentences, fewer questions, more direct instructions. This is where people sometimes make a dangerous assumption. They think they can still talk their way out of it. But by this stage, it's no longer about conversation. It's about control of the situation. Now imagine inside the vehicle, the driver senses this shift. They realize the stop is taking longer than expected. The officer is no longer casually chatting, and this is where the critical mistake can happen. Some individuals attempt to flee, not always dramatically. Sometimes it starts with subtle movement, hand shifting toward ignition, body tension increasing, vehicle slightly repositioning. But here's what most people don't realize. In Florida and most U.S. jurisdictions, officers are trained specifically for flight prevention during traffic stops. That means they are not waiting for the attempt to fully happen. They are already positioned to stop it. The moment the officer suspects a possible escape attempt, coordination begins instantly. Backup units close distance. The officer repositions. Exit path is visually controlled. The driver is continuously observed, and the situation becomes what law enforcement calls a high-control stop posture. Now, if a driver actually attempts to flee at this stage, it rarely lasts more than seconds, because patrol units are trained for immediate containment. The vehicle is boxed in. Radio coordination activates. Spike strips may already be pre-positioned in high-risk zones, and pursuit protocols begin within moments. But here's the key truth. In most cases, the escape never even fully begins, because the moment the driver realizes the level of control already established around them, they stop, and that realization often comes too late. Now let's step back and understand what actually prevents escalation in these situations. It is not force. It is not confrontation. It is control of movement, observation, and timing. Officers are trained to reduce uncertainty first. That means watching hands, controlling distance, positioning themselves safely, and maintaining communication without allowing unexpected actions. Now let's talk about something most people never consider. From the outside, a traffic stop looks like a conversation. From the inside of law enforcement training, it is a constantly updating risk assessment. Every second is evaluated. Every movement is categorized. Every response is measured against expected behavior patterns. That is why experienced officers often appear quiet during certain stops. They are not being passive. They are processing. Now let's return to the scenario. No escape attempt succeeds because before it can fully develop, the situation is already stabilized. Backup has arrived. The vehicle is fully contained, the driver is instructed to keep hands visible, and the stop transitions from traffic enforcement to full investigation procedure. At this point, questioning becomes more structured. Search decisions are no longer casual, and legal thresholds become the deciding factor for every next step. But here is the most important takeaway. In real law enforcement operations, most attempted escapes don't fail because of dramatic chase scenes. They fail because the system is already ahead of the action. Planning, positioning, awareness. That is what stops movement before it becomes danger. Now let's bring this back to you for a moment, because even if you are never in a situation like this, understanding how quickly perception changes during a stop is critical. Most people assume they have more control than they actually do. They think they can talk through anything, or react in the moment and fix it later. But traffic stops don't work like that. They move in phases. And once a phase escalates, you don't go backwards, only forward. That is why awareness matters more than reaction, because the difference between a routine stop and a high-risk stop is not always what happened. It is how it is interpreted, and interpretation happens fast, sometimes in seconds. So the real lesson here is not about escape. It is about understanding how quickly situations can escalate when behavior is misread or suspicion increases. Because once law enforcement shifts from routine mode to control mode, everything becomes structured, deliberate, and immediate. And at that point, there is no room for guessing what comes next. Only responding correctly to what is already in motion. And that is where most outcomes are decided, long before anyone realizes it.